the U.S. government has increasingly been muscling in between buyer and seller in the marketplaces of America. By Thomas Jefferson's standards, what we have today is not a wise and frugal government, but a spendthrift and snooping government. The men and women who have fostered this movement have been sincere. They believe that we as consumers are not able to protect ourselves, that we need the help of a wise and beneficent government. But as so often happens, the results have been very different from the intentions. Not only have our pockets been picked of billions of dollars, but also we are left less well protected than we were before.
I agree with Mr. Friedman with respect to those agencies which have had the major purpose of economically propping up a certain industry, which is why consumer advocates like myself advocate the elimination of the ICC, the CAB, the Maritime Commission. But when you're talking about consumer protection in the marketplace, and when you're talking about government watchdogging competition, consumers need, and as every poll is showing, they're demanding more and more protection. And to give just two examples of how information is simply not enough to protect the consumer. 5 years ago, I could not have bought a child's crib in this country that would have had the slats sufficiently close together that I did not have to worry about the child strangling. Not until the government and the Consumer Product Safety Commission stepped in did consumers then have the choice to buy that type of a crib. Strangulation's down 50%. And in 1975, if I had wanted to lease a Xerox machine, I could not have done it. And not until the Federal Trade Commission Antitrust stepped in and forced competition into that marketplace did I have that choice. And in 1 year, the price went from $14,000 down to $5,000. Those are dollars back in our pocketbooks, to say nothing of minimized emotional trauma.
And Joan Claybrook?
Well, in the auto safety field, we've saved about 55,000 lives and millions of injuries because of auto safety regulations since the mid-1960s. I might also comment that the cost of auto crashes each year to the American public is $48 billion a year. Fairly substantial when you compare it to other things, much less, again, the human trauma.
Bob Crandall.
Well, I think it's impossible to disagree with Milton Friedman on the effects of economic rate regulation of the sort that the railroads and the trucking industry have been through. The intent of that legislation was, of course, to protect the railroads and to protect the trucks, and the same thing is true for maritime regulation. What sustains regulation is sort of a populist theory that somehow, through government, we will redistribute wealth from people who own business firms to consumers. In fact, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way in economic regulation, and there's very little evidence that it works that way in any kind of regulation. As to whether we get any value from health and safety regulation, I think much of it is too new to know.
Well, now that's the area I want to start with, because remember, that was the first part of his argument, the whole idea of consumer product safety action by the state. Now, is that so far working? Very close to your interest, I know. What's your reaction, Kathleen O'Reilly?
Well, on product safety, in the state of that, the lawnmower industry had said for 20 years they could not design a safe lawnmower. Only when the Consumer Product Safety Commission forced them with the new standard, suddenly their creative genius was overnight. They came up with net whips that were made out of plastic, and they came up with very innovative forces, which is why that government presence actually triggered innovation that otherwise would have been left uncovered.
It's very easy to see the good results. The bad results, it's very much harder to see. You haven't mentioned the products that aren't there because the extra costs imposed by Consumer Product Safety Commission have prevented them from existing.
Right to test, don't you? For a government agency to test?
No, not at all.
No.
There are private consumer testing agencies. There's the Consumers Research. There's Consumers Union. You speak about a widespread demand for more protection. Those agencies have, those organizations.
They have all these publications on cars, so what they do is they test the brakes and steering. They never crash test them, and the most important thing to know about a car when you buy it is if the car crashes, are you going to be killed unnecessarily? So you can't even get that information.
But the reason they don't test them,
it's too expensive. That's the reason why.
Of course, and why is it too expensive for them? Because the number of consumers who are willing to buy their Surface and take it is very, very small.
That is not why. The reason why is because it's enormously expensive.
Of course, but if they had a large enough number of customers, if there were enough customers, enough consumers...
Yes, but that's a chicken and egg situation, which is ridiculous.
It's not a chicken and egg situation.
If you believe that technological information is important for consumers to have, which is the basis and the thesis of your argument, surely that you would say that one of the things that society does is it groups together to provide basic services to the public, police, traffic services, all sorts of basic kinds of things, the mail service and the fire service and all the rest of it. Why is it that they shouldn't even do testing of technological subjects which the public have no way of knowing?
Before you reply, I want one or two others in on this.
It seems to me that Professor Friedman could give a little bit on this ground. Certainly in the dissemination of information is a free rider problem. And one of the problems is that while you and I might value the results from a consumer union rather highly, we don't have to pay for it. We can look over the shoulder of someone else, borrow the magazine from the library, and so forth. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the government should not at all be in the business of generating information, though I am concerned about exactly the same forces, this evil industry that Ms. O'Reilly talks about, having its influence on how this information is prepared. I don't see how we guard ourselves against that. But it seems to me that there is a case to be made that the market does not supply enough information.
It may not, but the market supplies a great deal, and there's also a free rider problem in the negative sense on government provision of information, because people who have no use for that information are required to pay for it.
Milton, I don't quite understand your position on this. Are you saying, though, that there's no place for government to test consumer product safety at all?
I am saying, let's separate issues. I am saying there is no place for government to prohibit consumers from buying products the effect of which will be to harm themselves. There is, of course, a place... Well, for a moment, I'm trying to separate the issues. There is a place for government to protect third parties. If we go to your automobile case.
What about children? Children aren't choosers, right? They don't make choices.
Parents,
and they ride
parents make their choices. But let's go.
Sleepwear has it, there's no choice.
We can only take one issue at a time. We're a little difficult to take them all at once. Let's take one at a time. I say there is no place for government to require me to do something to protect myself. Now, if government has information,
obtained.
For a moment, suppose it has information, then it should make that public and available. The next question is, are there circumstances under which it's appropriate for government to collect information? There may be some such circumstances. They have to be considered one at a time. Sometimes there is and sometimes there isn't. But you see, I want to get back. Take your area, Ms. Claybrook. You are now involved on an airbag problem.
That's right.
If I understand the situation, I don't know anything about the technical aspects of it, but the airbag in a car is there to protect me as a driver. It doesn't prevent me from having an accident hurting somebody else because it's only activated by an accident. All right, now, why shouldn't I make that decision? Who are you to tell me that I have to spend whatever it is, $200, $300, $400 on that airbag?
Well, we don't tell you that. What we say is that when a car crashes into a brick wall at 30 miles an hour, the front seat occupants have to have automatic protection built into the car. And it's a very minimal...
Why have to? I don't care whether it's an airbag or a seat belt.
Well, there are two reasons why. One is that the sanctity of life is a fairly precious entity in this country.
It's more precious to me than it is to you. My life is more precious to me than to you.
Well, you don't know.
Do you wear your seat belt?
Sometime I do and sometime I
see. Well, then
don't.
It couldn't be too precious to you, because if it were, you'd wear it all the time.
I beg your pardon.
Yes.
Other things are precious too.
Yes. Okay, but wearing your seatbelt is a relatively simple thing to go into.
But now my question is, but I wanted to answer a direct answer.
There's a very basic reason why, and it's because a person does not know when they buy a car what that car is going to do when it performs in various and sundry different ways. That's number one. Number two, there's a basic minimum standard. It's a performance standard. It's not a requirement that you have certain pieces of products in your cars, but it's a basic performance standard built into your car that when you buy it, no one's going to have less than that, so that you don't have people needlessly injured on the highway, the cost to society, the cost to the individuals, the trauma to their families, and so on. You're suggesting theoretically that it's much better to let people go out and kill themselves, even though they really don't know that that's what's going to happen to them when they have that crash.
Excuse me, you're evading the fundamental issue. If you have the information, give it to them. The question is not a question of giving them the information. The question is, what is your right to force somebody to spend money to protect his own life
Not anybody else, but only himself.
Let me give you one piece of information about one area of very important health and safety regulation, which I think even Milton Friedman would be in favor of in some form, and that is the regulation of pollution control, or at least the establishment of property rights, so as to somehow reduce pollutant levels from what they would be if we allowed unlimited pollution. In the case of environmental policy, the strongest proponents in the Congress for environmental policy come from the northeastern part of the United States. And the weakest proponents, those with the worst voting record in the Congress, come from the Southwest and from Alaska. You might ask yourself, why is that? And one possible answer, I guess, is that, well, the air is dirty in New York City, but I don't think you'd find many people really worried about the quality of the air in New York City. What they're worried about is their future employment and the value of their assets in New York City. What would happen in the absence of environmental policy in this country is that more business would move to the Southwest and to the western part of the United States. As a result, Eastern congressmen are very much in favor of a policy which prohibits, through pollution control regulations, prohibits the gravitation. I don't prohibit the form it takes, but they use this as an excuse, just as they will use various excuses, let's say before the Ms. Claybrook's agency, to plump for very tight standards in order to promote the value of their firm.
Well, now, before we go back to ICC, and I want to do that, Milton, what's your reaction to his pollution point? Because I know he's very keenly interested in it.
Well, he and I would agree with his general position that there is a role for government in pollution. I would agree, second, that the present techniques of controlling pollution are terrible. And they are terrible, and they are what they are for precisely the reasons he specifies, because they are an effective way in which you can use the excuse of pollution to serve some very different objectives. There is a real role for government because that is a case in which you're protecting third parties. And every one of the valid cases, in my opinion, for government entering in has to do with third parties. There's a case for requiring brakes because that's to protect the person you might hit. That's wholly different. There's no case for requiring an airbag, in my opinion, but there is a case for requiring good brakes.
Do you accept that distinction, by the way?
No, because when you're injured because of a failure to use a passive restraint, I am, in a sense, going to have to help pick up part of your medical bills, part of your insurance rates, because they're spread across.
Absolutely.
And so only on Gilligan's Island, when you have 6 or 9 people not interacting such that all of society is affected, does your distinction have any validity?
The same thing
Go
is true in
slowly.
alcohol. When you're sick from alcoholism, who pays for it?
On the alcohol, the studies have only shown excessive amounts of alcohol to
I'm
be
not
injurious.
speaking of accident. What about cirrhosis of the liver, my dear? It's a very common
All
disease.
of the
And
reasons
it's a
why we
long
need
and
a
expensive
stronger
disease.
Could we pause on, Milton's made, though, a very interesting distinction here, that you can damage yourself, you've been saying, or it's up to you if you want to run the risk of damaging yourself. But can you make the distinction?
Let me go back to her question, because she says, no, we mustn't do that, because a fellow who hurts himself is going to go to a government-subsidized hospital.
Not just government.
Oh, but it's more
No.
than that. It's other parties' liability as well. Answer that issue with it.
Go slowly. Let me separate the two issues, because I really want to get to this, because your answer is a very favorite one, and there is an element of validity to it. Of course. Well, it's only because we've made 2 mistakes.
But you don't have to be in a government hospital for it to be valid, because when you're in traction...
Hold on for a moment. Hold on for a moment. The problem with your answer is that you're saying one wrong justifies another. I believe that we ought to have much less government intervention into those areas as well. And I am not willing to follow a policy which implies saying, that every person goes around with a sign on his back saying, property of the U.S. government, do not mutilate, spindle, or bend.
Do you favor the government intervention in those areas where, for example, the bar associations and the eyeglass industry were not allowing their members to advertise? And then the Federal Trade Commission stepped in, and now consumers have the ability to make those kinds of comparisons.
You're getting into another area, but the answer, the brief answer, because we oughtn't to discuss it here, I am against those governmental measures which have enabled the organizations to have the power to prevent advertising,
But
namely
there were no
licensure.
government.
Now,
That wasn't...
Now, look, I want to come back. Bob Crandall said that in an area like the Interstate Commerce Commission, there is nothing really to be said in defense at all. Does anybody dissent from that, or have we knocked them down flat?
That happens to be the one area on which, so far as I know, you cannot find any dissent anywhere. Even one of the most effective presentations of what was wrong with ICC was done by one of Ralph Nader's groups. Maybe you were associated with that group. That's the thing that really baffles me. Fundamentally, here are people like Ralph Nader and his groups who look at ICC. And what is their solution to the problem? More of the same. A different kind of regulation.
No.
The only problem is that the wrong people were in there regulating.